58 brand new Panther tanks rolled out of the factories in early September 1944, their crews barely trained, their paint still fresh. Hitler himself had ordered them east to stop the American juggernaut led by General George S. Patton. By the end of the month, only 8 would make it back. This is the story of the Battle of Arracourt, where superior German technology met American grit in the muddy fields of France, and where one of history's most crushing tank defeats unfolded in the fog of war. The autumn of 1944 was a desperate time for the Third Reich. Patton's Third Army had swept across France like a wildfire, and by early September, they were close enough to Germany to make Hitler's hands shake with rage. The Führer knew that if Patton crossed the Moselle River and punched through to the Saar, nothing would stop the Americans from reaching the Rhine and pouring into the German heartland. The West Wall fortifications weren't ready. Fresh divisions were still being formed. Time was running out. So Hitler did what desperate men do. He gambled everything on a counteroffensive. In a frantic series of orders issued on September 2nd, he authorized the creation of 10 new Panzer Brigades, numbered 101 through 110. Each would be equipped with Germany's most feared weapon, the Panther tank, a 45-ton monster with a long-barreled 75mm cannon that could blow the turret clean off an American Sherman from 2,000 meters away. The 113th Panzer Brigade was one of these new units. Unlike earlier formations that had been slowly built up and carefully trained, this brigade was thrown together in a matter of days. Young tank commanders who'd barely spent time in their new Panthers were rushed to the front. Mechanics who should have been checking every bolt and gear were pushed aside as the tanks rolled directly from the assembly lines to the battlefield. By September 6th, the 113th had 42 brand new Panthers ready for combat. Combined with the 111th Panzer Brigade and what remained of the veteran 11th Panzer Division, the German 5th Panzer Army could field over 260 armored vehicles for the counteroffensive. The man chosen to lead this desperate gamble was General Otto von Manchefeld, a diminutive but brilliant panzer commander whom Hitler had personally pulled from the Eastern Front. Manchefeld knew armor warfare like few others. He'd survived the brutal tank battles in Russia, where every mistake meant death and every victory was measured in blood. Now he was tasked with rolling back Patton's advance and recapturing the town of Lunéville, driving the Americans back across the Moselle River. On paper, it looked like a fair fight. The Germans had more tanks, and the Panthers were technologically superior to anything the Americans had. The M4 Sherman, Patton's main battle tank, was outgunned and outarmored. Its stubby 75mm gun couldn't penetrate a Panther's front armor even at point-blank range, while the Panther could kill a Sherman from a mile away. German commanders had grown accustomed to this advantage, believing that superior technology would always triumph over American numbers. But Manchefeld had one problem. The men defending Arracourt weren't ordinary soldiers. They were Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division, arguably the best American tank unit in Europe. These men had been fighting since Normandy, had learned their trade in the hedgerows, and were led by one of the war's most aggressive tank commanders, a colonel named Creighton Abrams, who would later have the M1 Abrams tank named in his honor. The 4th Armored had earned a reputation. They didn't wait for orders. They didn't fight by the book. When they saw an opportunity, they took it. When they were outnumbered, they found a way to win anyway. Their division commander, Major General John Wood, had a simple philosophy that he'd drilled into every tanker under his command: move fast, hit hard, and never, ever stop moving. By mid-September, Combat Command A was stretched thin around the small French village of Arracourt, holding a vulnerable salient that jutted deep into German-held territory. They knew something was coming. Artillery observers had spotted German tanks massing to the east. Radio intercepts suggested a major attack was imminent. But nobody knew exactly when or where the hammer would fall. September 18th dawned cold and wet. A thick fog rolled in from the east, so dense you couldn't see 50 yards in any direction. It was the kind of weather that made tank commanders nervous. Visibility was terrible. The radios crackled with static. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent, as if they knew something bad was about to happen. Around 8 o'clock that morning, the 113th Panzer Brigade began its attack. 42 Panthers, engines roaring, treads churning up mud, advanced through the fog toward the American positions. The plan was simple: smash through the thin American outposts, drive straight to Arracourt, and roll up the flank of Patton's entire army. It should have worked. The Germans had the numbers, the firepower, and the element of surprise. But war rarely goes according to plan. The fog that concealed the German advance also robbed them of their greatest advantage. The Panther's powerful 75mm gun was designed for long-range killing. At 2,000 meters, a Panther could pick off Shermans with ease. But in the fog, visibility was down to a few hundred yards. That superior range meant nothing. The American defenders couldn't see the Panthers coming, but they could hear them. The distinctive rumble of German tank engines, the metallic clanking of treads, the grinding of gears as the massive machines navigated the muddy terrain. Outpost observers frantically radioed headquarters. Enemy armor approaching. Lots of them. Moving fast. Captain William Dwight, a liaison officer driving back to headquarters that morning, literally ran into the rear of a German tank column on the road near Bizange. The fog was so thick the Germans didn't even notice him. Dwight threw his jeep into reverse, backed away slowly until he was out of sight, then floored it, and raced to find Colonel Abrams. The German attack was coming, and it was coming now. Abrams was at Lezy, a crossroads village northeast of Arracourt, when he got the warning. He immediately ordered his tanks to defensive positions, using every bit of cover the terrain offered. Sherman tanks pulled into barns and behind stone walls. Tank destroyers took up positions in tree lines. Artillery battalions ranged their guns on the likely approach routes. And then they waited. The Panthers came out of the fog like ghosts. Massive, angular, deadly. Their long gun barrels swept back and forth, searching for targets. But the Americans held their fire, waiting until the range closed, waiting until they couldn't possibly miss. At 300 yards, the Shermans opened up. The first Panther to die never saw what hit it. A 75mm shell punched through its thinner side armor, and the tank exploded in a fountain of flame. The German crew didn't have time to bail out. Then another Panther died. And another. In the fog and confusion, the German tanks couldn't coordinate their response. They couldn't use their superior range. They couldn't even tell where the American fire was coming from. American tank tactics at Arracourt were brutally effective. Sherman crews had learned one critical lesson from earlier battles: you can't beat a Panther head-on, so don't try. Instead, they used what they called shoot and scoot tactics. A Sherman would pop up from behind cover, fire a shot at a Panther's vulnerable side or rear armor, then immediately pull back before the German gunner could return fire. Then another Sherman would pop up from a different position and fire again. The Germans called it swarm tactics. The Americans called it survival. Captain Richard Lameson's tank platoon scored one of the battle's most devastating ambushes that morning. His 4 Shermans had taken position on a ridge overlooking the road from Bizange. The fog was so thick they could barely see the road itself. But Lameson had positioned an infantry observation post forward, connected by telephone wire, and when the observers reported 8 Panthers approaching, Lameson's crews were ready. The Panthers came up the road in column, which was the worst possible formation for an ambush. They were bunched together, couldn't maneuver, couldn't bring their guns to bear effectively. Lameson waited until the lead Panther was less than 600 meters away, then gave the order to fire. All 4 Shermans opened up simultaneously. The lead Panther was hit 3 times and exploded. The second tank tried to reverse but was struck and set ablaze. The third and fourth Panthers attempted to turn off the road but got bogged down in the muddy field, becoming sitting ducks. By the time the remaining German tanks figured out what was happening and tried to back away into the fog, it was too late. Lameson's platoon had destroyed 8 Panthers in less than 10 minutes. But perhaps the strangest hero of Arracourt was a man who wasn't even in a tank. Major Charles Carpenter was an Army observation pilot, flying a tiny Piper L-4 Cub spotter plane nicknamed Rosie the Rocketer. Carpenter had gotten tired of just spotting enemy tanks and calling in artillery. He'd had his ground crew mount 6 bazooka tubes under his plane's wings, creating what might have been the world's first armed reconnaissance aircraft. On the morning of September 20th, when the fog finally lifted around noon, Carpenter spotted a company of Panthers advancing toward Arracourt. What he did next was either incredibly brave or completely insane, possibly both. He dove his tiny fabric-covered plane through heavy German ground fire and began making attack runs on the Panthers, firing his bazooka rockets at their thinner top armor. The German tankers couldn't believe what they were seeing. A tiny scout plane, the kind usually used for spotting artillery, was attacking them. Carpenter made pass after pass, dodging machine gun fire, emptying all 6 rocket tubes. Then he flew back to base, had his crew reload, and came back for more. By the end of the day, he'd flown multiple sorties, fired 16 bazooka rockets, and scored hits on several Panthers. The psychological effect on the German tank crews was devastating. If they weren't safe from attack even in their massive armored machines, what chance did they have? The first day's fighting had been a disaster for the 113th Panzer Brigade. By nightfall on September 19th, they'd lost 43 tanks, mostly brand new Panthers that had barely had time to break in their engines. American losses were minimal: 6 killed, 13 wounded, and a handful of tanks knocked out. The battle should have been over. But Hitler's orders were absolute. Continue the attack. Ignore the losses. Drive the Americans back. General Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding Army Group G, personally berated Manchufel for the failure and ordered him to renew the assault the next morning, regardless of casualties. So the Germans tried again. And again. And again. For 11 days, from September 19th to September 29th, German tank units threw themselves against the American positions around Arracourt. The 111th Panzer Brigade joined the fight. Elements of the 11th Panzer Division were fed into the meat grinder. Fresh units arrived from Germany only to be destroyed within days. The Americans, meanwhile, were fighting the battle of their lives. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. But they had 3 advantages that proved decisive. First, they knew the terrain. Every ridge, every tree line, every stone wall that could provide cover had been scouted and marked. American tank commanders could navigate the battlefield blindfolded, while the Germans were constantly stumbling into ambushes. Second, they had air support. When the weather cleared, P-47 Thunderbolts from the 19 Tactical Air Command screamed down on the German columns, their rockets and bombs turning the roads into burning wreckage. German tanks that survived the ground battle were destroyed from the air before they could retreat. Third, and perhaps most important, they had artillery. American artillery doctrine in World War II was the best in the world, and at Arracourt, it reached perfection. Forward observers called in fire missions with devastating accuracy. When German tanks concentrated for an attack, American shells rained down on them. When German infantry tried to support the armor, artillery fire tore them apart. The Germans called it Roosevelt's Orchestra, because it never seemed to stop playing. By September 22nd, the battle had reached its climax. The Germans made one final desperate push, throwing everything they had left at the American positions. Panzer Grenadier infantry assaulted through heavy artillery fire. The remaining Panthers tried one more time to break through. For a few hours, the outcome hung in the balance. But the American line held. Every German attack was met with withering fire from tanks, tank destroyers, artillery, and infantry. When German tanks broke through in one sector, American reserves rushed in to plug the gap. When Panthers got too close to headquarters units, self-propelled howitzers engaged them at point-blank range, using their artillery as giant shotguns. By September 24th, most of the fighting had shifted to nearby Chateau Salins, where the Germans made one last attempt to overwhelm Combat Command B. American fighter bombers arrived just in time to save the day, their rockets sending the German infantry reeling back. On September 26th, Third Army received orders to suspend all offensive operations and consolidate their gains. The rapid advance across France had stretched supply lines to the breaking point. Gasoline was running short. Ammunition was running low. Even Patton, the most aggressive general in the U.S. Army, had to admit that his forces needed time to rest and refit. But the Germans didn't know that. They thought their counteroffensive had succeeded in stopping Patton's advance. In their after-action reports, German commanders actually claimed victory at Arracourt, arguing that they'd achieved their objective of halting the American drive to the Saar. The reality was quite different. The final accounting of the Battle of Arracourt was brutal. Of the 262 German tanks and assault guns that entered the battle, only 62 were still operational by the end of September. 86 had been completely destroyed, many of them burned out wrecks scattered across the fields of Lorraine. Another 114 were damaged or broken down, abandoned as the Germans retreated back toward the frontier. The 113th Panzer Brigade had been effectively destroyed. Of its original 42 Panthers, fewer than 8 were still running by the battle's end. The 111th Panzer Brigade had suffered similar losses. The 11th Panzer Division, which had arrived to reinforce the attack with 40 tanks, was reduced to a skeleton force. American losses, by comparison, were remarkably light. Combat Command A, which had borne the brunt of the German assault, lost 25 tanks and 7 tank destroyers. The entire 4th Armored Division lost 48 tanks during September, including those destroyed in other actions. Casualties were 225 killed and 648 wounded for the entire month. But the numbers only tell part of the story. The Battle of Arracourt destroyed more than German tanks. It destroyed German confidence in their technological superiority. It destroyed Hitler's hope of stopping the Allied advance in Lorraine. It destroyed the myth that superior equipment was enough to win battles. The Panthers that rolled into Arracourt were magnificent machines, the finest tanks Germany had produced. But they were crewed by inexperienced boys led by commanders who had no time to train together, supported by infantry that couldn't keep up, and sent into battle against veterans who knew every trick in the book. Technology alone doesn't win wars. Training wins wars. Experience wins wars. Leadership wins wars. And at Arracourt, the Americans had all three. After the battle, General Patton himself visited the 4th Armored Division's headquarters. He walked among the tank crews, shaking hands, slapping backs, grinning like a proud father. These were his boys, his tankers, and they just won one of the greatest tank battles in American history. Years later, the Battle of Arracourt would be studied in military academies around the world as a textbook example of how to defeat superior enemy armor. The tactics developed by the 4th Armored Division, the use of terrain, the coordination of tanks and artillery, the aggressive exploitation of enemy mistakes, would influence armored warfare doctrine for decades. Colonel Creighton Abrams would go on to become Army Chief of Staff, and when the United States developed its next-generation main battle tank in the 1980s, they named it the M1 Abrams in his honor. That tank would serve with distinction in the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan, proving that the lessons learned in the fog at Arracourt still mattered 40 years later. But perhaps the most important lesson of Arracourt had nothing to do with tactics or technology. It was about the human element of warfare. The German tank crews were just as brave as the Americans. They fought hard, they followed orders, and they died in burning tanks far from home. But they'd been sent into battle unprepared, poorly trained, and led by commanders operating under impossible orders from a dictator who refused to accept reality. The American tankers were scared too. They knew they were outgunned. They knew a single hit from a Panther could kill them instantly. But they trusted their leaders, they trusted their training, and they trusted each other. That made all the difference. Today, if you drive through the fields around Arracourt, you can still find pieces of the battle. Spent shell casings rusted into the soil. Chunks of tank armor half buried in the mud. The occasional German helmet or American canteen, relics of that desperate September when 58 brand new Panthers rolled east to stop Patton, and only 8 came back. The villagers of Arracourt remember. They remember the sound of tank guns echoing across the fields. They remember hiding in their cellars while shells screamed overhead. They remember emerging after the battle to find their once peaceful countryside littered with burning tanks and dead men from both sides. Every year, on the anniversary of the battle, local historians gather at Arracourt to tell the story to a new generation. They walk the ground where Lamesson's platoon ambushed the Panthers. They point out the ridge where Abrams positioned his command post. They show visitors the barn where American tanks lay in wait as the German armor rolled past in the fog. And they remind everyone who will listen that war isn't just about tanks and tactics and technology. It's about young men, far from home, fighting for causes bigger than themselves. Some of those men were wearing German gray, and some were wearing American olive drab, but they all bled the same. The Panthers that never came home weren't just machines. They were symbols of Germany's failing war effort, proof that even the best equipment couldn't overcome poor training, worse leadership, and the simple fact that by September 1944, Germany had already lost the war. They just hadn't admitted it yet. For the American tankers of the 4th Armored Division, Arracourt was validation. Validation that their training worked, that their tactics worked, and that American soldiers could beat the best Germany had to offer. 3 months later, many of those same tankers would fight at the Battle of the Bulge, where German Panther and Tiger tanks would attack again in even greater numbers. But the Americans knew they could win. They'd already done it once, in the fog at Arracourt. The 58 Panthers that Hitler sent to stop Patton are gone now. 8 limped back to Germany, only to be destroyed in later battles. The rest remain in France, their steel long since rusted away or cut up for scrap. But the story lives on, a reminder that in war, as in life, it's not always the strongest or the best equipped who prevail. Sometimes it's simply those who are better prepared, better led, and better able to adapt when plans fall apart and the fog rolls in. And that's a lesson worth remembering, whether you're fighting a tank battle in France or just trying to navigate the challenges of everyday life. Superior equipment is nice to have, but it's no substitute for skill, training, teamwork, and the courage to keep fighting even when you're outgunned and scared. The veterans of Arracourt knew that. The Germans who died there learned it too late. And the rest of us would do well to remember their example, because the principles that won the Battle of Arracourt aren't just military history. They're timeless truths about what it takes to succeed against the odds, to overcome superior opposition, and to emerge victorious when defeat seems certain. 58 Panthers went in. 8 came back. And in between those numbers lies one of the most remarkable stories of World War II, waiting in the fog for anyone willing to listen.